Welcome to Higher Ground, a podcast that looks at the K12 leadership job market with a data-driven approach. Your co-hosts are Christina Greenberg, the CEO of Agility Search, who brings 2 decades of experience leading executive searches and meeting the talent needs of mission-driven organizations. And my name's Josh Czupryk. I founded Josh's K12 Jobs Blast and have been cataloging the K12 job market for the last 3 years. Now, stay tuned for today's pod. Hey, y'all. Welcome back to episode 5 of Higher Ground. We're excited that you are continuing our journey of thinking about the way that leadership has evolved in K12. My name's Josh from Josh's Jobs Blast.
Christina Greenberg from Agility Search.
And today we're just going to talk about the fact that in the first 4 episodes, we kept hearing the theme that people are tired in our sector.
Definitely. And I think we hear it at all levels, Josh. One of the things that I'm starting to see is, or a concern I have, I guess, is we're still getting a fair amount of people that are excited to serve at that CEO or senior level. You and I just were talking about that off camera at the C-suite. But we're starting to see a thinning of the ranks, definitely in teachers and now even in school leadership. And my worry is we need those school leaders today because they're the CEOs of tomorrow. And so what are some of the things as you talk with people you think we need to do to keep them engaged and energized and involved in the sector?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I was talking to a group of chief people officers the other day, just to kind of get a pulse on what's going on, to inform part of this and part of the other work. And they're like, we're starting to see people in the classroom not wanting to go into leadership because they've specifically stated at multiple CMOs that the leaders look tired and they don't want that. And then they said that they've seen school leaders reticent to go into a central office job or central office leadership. Same thing. They're like, I know this. And part of it that they hypothesized was, is the current state of the country affecting people in terms of whether they're going to look or not? Because if the one place you can find stability is in your current job, what if I just stayed in my current job? I'm curious, what are you seeing?
I would agree. I think that part of what I'm hearing from system leaders is they're realizing they need to shift a little bit what we're asking of school leaders and how we're positioning the job so that, to your point, not only existing school leaders want to stay, but folks that would come into leadership want to actually come into leadership in the first place. And I think I talked about this before, but I do think that we're putting so many demands on folks now. 15 years ago, it used to be run great schools, do great academics, have your 4 walls be strong. That's all you need. And then we were like, okay, you also need to involve community too, families and community. And now with the politics, enrollment challenges we're seeing across the country, I think it's just become so much more expansive for folks. And so what I'd love to see us think about how do we make that job doable again? Maybe by narrowing the scope of what we're asking of school leaders, maybe by providing, whether it's extra support in terms of staff or looking at ways we can leverage systems or technology or other options to make their jobs a little easier. We can't take our foot off the gas of student achievement. Like we can't fail kids, but we also need to make sure how we make it sustainable so people want to stay. So I do think that there's a real conversation to be had around what can we do short billions of dollars in resources, which we don't have, and short a change in the day-to-day of education, which we're not changing. What are the things we can do to make it more sustainable for people?
Yeah, I think about the fact that, again, these folks are not moving between roles. We're not seeing the same. I don't know what y'all are seeing. I mean, y'all are at a different level in terms of the searches you're doing, but click volume is there for me, but actual application from the clicks is not there. Like people are curious, but they're not necessarily following through. And I made a LinkedIn post the other day that, I make some LinkedIn posts for sure that can be controversial, but one that really got some comments going where I said, hey, if your teachers are quitting, you have a principal problem. And I had a number of principals both comment and send me messages being like, I don't think you realize how handcuffed we are. We are middle management. We are both managing faculty, we're managing families, we're managing community relationships, and we're not doing it with full autonomy. And so therefore, we're almost the front people carrying the message that we didn't decide on. And it makes it really, really hard. So when you say that the onus of teacher retention falls at the feet of principals, it's really discouraging. And I was like, dang, step back, right? Check myself. And it was really helpful, but it made me think I wonder how many school leaders are feeling this. And I actually wonder, since you do so much work with boards, are CEOs, executive directors, and superintendents feeling this? They're the front people of the board.
They are. And I think part of it is they're not able to support their school leaders as much as they used to, again, because there is a lot of noise. outside. They're trying to survive. They're trying to make sure, I know at least here in California, we had a pause on charter renewals for a while after the pandemic, but that's been lifted. So there's a backlog. So a lot of folks are having to just, literally fight for their survival by submitting their charter petitions and their renewals and get through. Some folks are seeing pressure from enrollment. And so they're feeling like they have to fight for survival in terms of finding kids and keeping kids and families when they may be in areas where there's been a reduction in the number of school-age children at all. Right? Particularly attending schools. And I think that the politics at the moment have gotten more complicated too, on both the left and the right, right? I think we all know from the right, and we hear a lot in education circles about what's happening in the conservative movement and from the federal government. And that is all very real. And from state governments, right? Echoing the federal government. There's also pressure on the left, right? Around ensuring that you're being equitable and that you're progressive enough and that you're doing all these policies, which are all things we all believe in. But we have to make sure that we're being fair to schools about what schools can offer and deliver. Schools can't do everything for everyone, right? They can educate kids really well and support kids and families within the 7 hours a day they have kids in school. But I think we also have to be careful that we're not putting too much pressure there either. So I think it's just there's a lot on people. One thing I've been thinking a lot about is like, okay, well, people are going to have vacancies. Sometimes you have a pipeline, but you have to go from the outside sometimes. Sometimes that's a really good thing. A lot of my searches, we have internal candidates, even for C-level roles, but folks are still doing a full search because they want to make sure they pick the best candidate. And also, even if you're internal, I always argue that doing a full process gives you credibility and validity, that you're the right person for the job. But as we're trying to look at outside people, Josh, what do you think we need to re-energize our schools and systems? What kind of folks, what kind of abilities are we looking for? Is that different than it was maybe 5 years ago? I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I've been really thinking a lot, hey, we're going to get personal for a second. Like I'm in the middle of writing my dissertation, right? Finish chapters 1 through 3. So all I do is read academic articles. One thing I've been thinking a lot about is the Gen Z principle. Right. And Gen Z right now at the upper echelon is 28, but they're starting to think about assistant principalships, deans, and they're in the pipeline. And Gen Z operates, I think, so authentically and differently than millennials, Gen X, and boomers in terms of saying, I want to do really good mission aligned work. I also want there to be boundaries. I want there to be healthy. I don't want to get yelled at work, right? Like I want to be a full adult who gives my all and then has a family or goes hiking or does the other thing. And I think if we're attracting people externally, I think it is about having the conversation about what does the realistic expectations of the role look like. But then I think as a autistic person, right, when you're bringing somebody in from the outside, giving the unspoken and spoken rules of the game, right? In our internal culture, here's how we operate. We do not text message before 8 a.m. We do not text message after 4:30 p.m. Because what you don't want is to be the bull in the glass shop who's just knocking everything over inadvertently with the best of intention. I think that's one thing that can be a risk at taking somebody externally, but I think it can be mitigated by just having clarity, as Brene Brown says, clear as kind, and just telling people as they're coming on. What are you thinking?
Well, what you just said made me think of something that we also have talked about previously, which is the hidden genius in different kinds of staff. And I know this is a little bit off script, but I'm curious to hear from you. You talk a lot. You're very open about being a neurodiverse person. And I think there's so many benefits that come from having diverse teams in all ways. And I'm curious if I'm an employer and I'm thinking about how to increase the neurodiversity on my team, what are gifts that people could bring? Or what are things that I need to do to ensure that I'm being friendly to anyone who steps in the door of my organization, regardless of where they're coming from?
Yeah, it's so funny. I had totally forgotten, pre-COVID, I don't know how you are, but sometimes I can forget things where I'm like, oh yeah, that happened, right? That happened. I was joking about trains and train schedules, which is an autistic trope. And one of my friends was like, do you remember when you built the bus routes for your 5-school charter network in 3 hours by doing GIS? And I was like, yeah, I did. Because what was happening was our buses were taking too long. The bus expenses were too much and we weren't meeting enrollment. So I said, just let me see all the kids' addresses, popped them into a GIS and rebuilt the bus routes. And then was like, here are the new routes. Here's how we'll get them out to families. And I remember everybody, I didn't know I was autistic at the time. I knew it was different. Didn't know what it was called. And I just remember everybody being like, how long did that take? And I was like, about 2.5 hours, right? And here's every child's like individual PDF bus route time. Let's mail merge it out. Now, I'm not saying that everybody has, a waiting or Rain Man, right, capabilities, but I do think that there are hidden geniuses in all people, a superhero brain and plain brain alike. But one thing I think, like, if people are thinking about bringing on more neurodiverse people, I gotta like advocate and ring the bell. I hated managing people. That doesn't mean that all autistic people hate managing people. But when I peel back, I realize it was managing people something I can do if that's the only thing I'm doing. But if you're also going to give me projects to manage as well, like my attention can go one way or the other. And cognitively, we know that is because the different planes of the brain for neurodiverse people, we spike in parts of our brain, and it's hard for those parts to communicate like it is for a neurotypical person. So I think it is, what does it look like to have and allow hyperfocus and unleash upon a problem, but also really, really, really giving clarity in terms of the rules of the road of how to engage with others. What are you hearing from people who are thinking about it?
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think that, we talk about this a lot with kids, but, doing things that help folks who think differently, learn differently, doing things that help support them usually support everybody, right? And I have a dear friend, I've mentioned to you, my friend David Flink, who, spent his career thinking about how to support other neurodiverse kids. Like he was a neurodiverse kid once upon a time. Now he's a neurodiverse adult. And sort of how do we help people support each other, but also recognize their own brilliance? And then he's actually translated that now to companies and helping them think about the brilliance. One small example that aligns to your example is there was a company that needed to train drones. And training drones is extremely tedious because you need to look at, thousands of data points and pinpoint them and move the little camera on the drone to the place where the thing is and match the data and see is the drone aligned or not, right? And they literally realized that this guy was like, I have a superpower. I have a team of folks who are autistic who love doing that super detail oriented data work. He's like, but I had to totally change how my office works. They're like, what do you mean? I had to give people flexible hours because people needed to do this whenever their brain was ready to do it. I had to have low lights. I had to have noise canceling headphones. I had to have a distraction free environment. I had to allow people to work from home sometimes because they needed to be in a space where they could concentrate. And I had to have like a series of changes made and lack of expectation to socialize, right? Letting people to go to team meetings or a birthday party, right? If they wanted to, that was great, but like totally change. And yet it worked perfectly. And he had really high retention and incredibly high performance rates, right? So I think that there are things like that where how are we creating environments to suit people and to support people where they are? And I think about that in leadership too. We tend to think about leaders being one way. And your point about I can manage people, but maybe I don't love to manage people, right? Or maybe I love to manage people if that's all I do. How are we talking with the individuals who are our leaders and our future pipeline, which is always my thing, like how are we thinking about future pipeline and saying, Josh, what's your zone of brilliance? You probably can't be full-time doing bus routes, but what are the things that you can do full-time and you've done this, right? With the job blast, right? You took a problem that existed in K12 that no one could solve and you're like, I'm going to solve it and I'm going to have the data ready and I'm going to love that and love that work, right? So I think how are we tapping into people's personal genius and ensuring that organizations are doing that too?
Well, that's I was going to say a good segue for our guest. And I have to hype up before you do the intro. So I am a proud legacy Broad Center alum from 2016-18. And I'm incredibly excited about the transition they made to the Yale School of Management, but wanted to tee up so you could introduce who our guest is for today.
Yeah. So when we were, Josh, when you and I were thinking about who we wanted to talk to about talent in the sector, I thought there was no one better than Natasha Trivers. As you've teed up, Natasha is also a Broad alumna. She is currently running the Broad Center at Yale, but she also just stepped away from having spent over a dozen years at Democracy Prep Public Schools, where she rose from being an assistant principal into principal and then eventually into CEO. And so she's coming out of exactly these roles we're talking about and knows them so well. She's still a board member at Democracy Prep, but now is thinking about how are we training leadership for the next generation across the sector and across the country. And so we talk about, what does that look like? What is the leadership today versus how it used to be? What do we need to be keeping in mind about leadership for tomorrow? And what does equity in leadership look like? What are the principles that we have to always hold on to no matter what as we're leading leaders and leading kids? So very excited for everyone to hear that conversation.
So we'll stay tuned, everybody, and we'll see y'all next time.
Great. Thank you. So I am thrilled to be here today with Natasha Trivers, who leads the Broad Center. Natasha just finished leadership at Democracy Prep, where she was for more than a dozen years. And very excited to have her here today. Natasha, you led at Democracy Prep and now you're at Broad. And I'm curious what shifts you've seen in leading in education during your many years in the space.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Christina. I think the two key shifts that I've seen is like it's a more sort of politically volatile environment that public education leaders are leading in today. And then the second sort of related challenge is that the workforce is less reverent and less like, let's just follow this leader, which is actually a good problem to have, in my opinion. Like the workforce is more like, we are going to challenge and we are going to ask and we are going to speak truth to power. But it can leave an education leader who's already in this like politically volatile, risky environment, who also doesn't have followers that are just going to like follow and not question. It could leave leaders feeling, burnt out and challenged and like I'm not getting my flowers or like a lot of praise. I'm just taking a lot of risk and sort of a lot of hits. But again, I think the part about the workforce pushing back is actually a good problem to have. It makes sure that leaders can hear the voices of stakeholders and not have tunnel vision when they're making decisions. So my biggest advice to like counteract that for leaders is like, you should have your own kitchen cabinet. You should have your own people, like fellow leaders that you can lean on for like a sanity check or a gut check or just to receive your flowers and your praise in a way that's appropriate and can kind of like fill you back up so that you can get back out there and do the important work that you're doing.
It's so interesting what you're saying because it's true. In leadership circles, people are complaining in a lot of cases, right? And a lot of it's because they're tired or they feel like they're working so hard. Or there's always this refrain among people our age, like, well, I just put my head down and got my work done. I just kept my mouth shut. Why can't these people do that?
Yeah.
And I think it's a really interesting frame to say, well, maybe as leaders, it's actually a good thing that people are pushing back. And how are we making sure that we're aware of that as we lead? And I'm curious, as you guys do your work at Broad, and I know you're teaching a class there too at Yale, like, how do you frame that for leaders, or how do you help them reframe, in addition to the kitchen cabinet piece, but how they're working with their workforce and how they support people and not give in, but also make sure that they're not being obstinate or frustrated by it too?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think number one, if we hear ourselves saying like, oh, this younger generation, like, oh boy, like that should be a flag for us as leaders. Like we should, in my opinion, always be looking to the youth and the new generation for like, what's the direction? Where should we be going? And I think looking at Gen Z and later Gen Alpha as like, generations with amazing assets and amazing ways of thinking and amazing ability to challenge in ways that we as Gen Xers or millennials didn't feel like we could. So to reframe it as there are positives and there are assets here to really leverage in the same way we would do with our students, right? We would try to approach it with an asset framework for students as opposed to a deficit frame. And I think we have to do the same with our younger workforce. But then I also think there is experience and there is bridging that for newer employees too, and saying like, let me hear your feedback. Let me create mechanisms for really hearing feedback. But let me also offer other perspectives and make sure that I have a diverse workforce with all the generations represented, and some of that wisdom and experience from other employees should be at the table as well.
Makes a lot of sense. You know as well as anyone, it's a tough job to be a CEO or superintendent of a school system these days. And I'm curious what advice you'd have for funders or boards who are supporting folks through transition. I think there's a lot of complaints sometimes about boards and funders, but what would you recommend to them, or what do you recommend to them when you're talking with them?
Yeah, I think it's really important for both funders and boards, especially through a transition, a succession planning sort of sequence, to stick with your leader, listen to them, do a lot of listening conversations with the outgoing leader, and do it as early as possible before you even know that your CEO or superintendent might be transitioning. It's important to, just like the CEO should always be thinking about who her successor is or successors could be and building that bench, the board should be thinking about that too and treating the CEO as this is an important employee who I should be always asking, what's your 5-year plan? Let's not just leave it on the shoulders for the CEO to do that. For her direct reports, the board should be doing that with the CEO as well. And I think if there's constantly this conversation about whenever you do leave, what do you think is going to be critical? What moves do you want to make in the short term to really create that runway for a new person? And what should we as a board be doing? And then for funders, stick with an organization, stick with the strength of a leader. just because a leader you funded in the past is now transitioning, it doesn't mean it's time to sort of like parachute back out and not support that org, because if you believed in that leader, then you should believe in the legacy she's leaving behind and all the moves she's made to make sure this organization is super strong and can sustain excellence over time. So I've seen a lot of education funders kind of like bailing on leaders too quickly, in my opinion, especially when a transition happens. And that's when the organization probably needs more steady resources rather than fewer.
That's such a good point. I think we've really seen that in our space. And we've seen sometimes leaders that have succeeded, others kind of mention that, whether publicly or privately, like, hey, they really funded my predecessor and now they're not funding me or they're not supporting me. And what is that about? And I think, in the best case scenario, funders are catalyzing growth and expansion and new ideas. And in the worst case, they're kind of giving people money and then pulling out and capricious. And I don't think either is totally, I don't think either extreme is true. But where do you think funders could be making bets, or what's the best way for them to catalyze that growth, knowing that they can't fund the same things forever at the same level? But where are the places that you think they could be making more bets or moving money more than they are today?
Yeah. And I love that you brought up expansion, Christina, because that's actually where I would go. I think a lot of times funders and even boards, especially of charter boards from the heyday, like early 2000s, they see success as growth or replication. And sometimes that's true. You have an excellent model and you can replicate it strategically and responsibly. And now you're serving more kids with that excellent model. Like, you should want to invest in that. But sometimes growth is not the answer, and it's not the only thing in terms of seat growth that needs to be funded. Sometimes we need to look at growth as like, what are some really core pillars to this organization that if they could perfect, they now would be able to export out to other school systems free of charge, just like a service to the sector. And so I think when I think about my time at Democracy Prep, like civics and the way we did international trips, international travel, we're like, state of the art. Like, other school systems, including traditional public school systems, could like benefit from that if we had funders helping us codify what does it mean to do a strong, powerful civics education program from grade 6 to 12, and what does it mean to codify an international travel program that is completely on the public dollar. It actually does not require philanthropy to let the kids travel. The philanthropy might be necessary to codify what that excellent practice is and then make it publicly available. Now you have lots of school systems replicating great civics programming, great international travel. More kids are getting that cultural capital and like being able to travel the world and having these transformational experiences. It's not seat growth, but it is like growing the impact of a program. And I wish funders would think about investments more in that light, especially right now where we have dwindling enrollment in some cities. Replicating and just building more schools is probably not the move in a lot of different pockets of urban centers, but replicating excellent practice and excellent programs and exporting it out to more school systems is a really, I think, fruitful way to let your dollars do really incredible things for kids.
And that could be true in nonprofits too. I mean, I know a lot of us have worked in those nonprofits that were scaling and had a really amazing model that was working really well. And there's always that tension. You want to share it with more people. You want to expand it to more people. And yet sometimes the program does degrade, right? Or your ability to, in my case, having worked for a large national program that had an admissions process, that had a very, very high bar. When we expanded really quickly, that both meant we weren't able to train everyone to the same extent for the selection bar, as well as we just had to bring in a lot more people, and it was sort of the bar shifted. And so it doesn't mean that that's a bad thing, but it just means then you have to shift your programmatic services, right, to serve a different group of folks. And how are you doing that? So it can cause a lot of tension. I know a lot of people don't want to talk about equity these days, but it's still really important for everything we do.
Not a dirty word in my world. So
I know. Well, me neither. They always say, a lot of it is not making it a buzzword, but how are you actually embedded in practice? And I know that's something you care so deeply about as a human and as a leader, but how do we make sure that that is a lived value in leadership and our pipelines and the people in our sector at a time when it is kind of seen as a dirty word?
Yeah. Thank you for that question, Christina. I think what I would lean on, what I often wrap my arms around is systems and data is where equity needs to live, right? Like, we should, in the hiring practices, if we're trying to truly build equity in terms of the workforce we bring in and a diverse workforce, we all know the data and the research that says a more diverse workforce is going to get us better outcomes as a team. We truly want to live that, then we have to build systems that are going to ensure that we have equitable outcomes in the hiring process. So structured interview processes, removing bias from the structured interview process, making sure that we have certain protocols in place for each round of the interview to ensure that we're speaking to different professional styles, different ways to measure diversity just even in the process. Same thing for student outcomes, who has access to AP courses, who has access to the international field trip. Like, there are ways to build equitable systems that are going to ensure the outcomes you want. And by the way, it makes you pretty bulletproof to some of the crazy attacks against equity. Like, at the end of the day, these are just systems to make sure we're improving access for all students. And so that shouldn't be controversial in any way.
Yeah, and same in selection, right? Like, we can call it an equity and selection training. We can call it an anti-bias training. We can call it interview prep, right? And I've called it all those things for people. The same session, right? The same content, right? And a lot of it's like, how are we making sure that we're creating process and systems to ensure equity and fairness and transparency throughout all of our
for
systems.
sure.
So I know your time's precious, but I have a final question. What's the most important lesson you learned as a practitioner that you carry into your, higher scale work today?
Well, that's such a great one. Going back to my teacher hat and my teacher leader hat, I think where you can build in rigor and engagement, it's going to help you build the culture of the organization you want. So I think back to my English classroom in Boston, shout out to Mattapan, Dorchester, Hyde Park, where I first started teaching. I wanted a classroom that was vibrant and where there were not a lot of behavior infractions. Like, I ran a tight ship. I wanted to run a great classroom where kids could learn. And I found really quickly that leaning on the more reactive measures of running a tight classroom, the dean's office, demerits, et cetera, that's often too little too late. What you want for a great classroom is a really rigorous, interesting, engaging lesson where kids are doing things and talking and actually wrestling with the learning and the concepts themselves. And I think that same thing carried through to how I led the best professional development I could when I became a seasoned principal. I brought that same sort of frame. Like, how can we make this rigorous for adults, challenging, engaging? Well, then they're going to be more excited about it. They're going to lean into the goals we've set, the KPIs we've set, the way we're doing things as a school. They're going to be all in because it's actually challenging and interesting to them. And I think the same thing when I became superintendent and CEO. Our cabinet had to wrestle with problems. As CEO, I can't be the person solving every problem, not only because of my own burnout, but because no one wants to work in an organization where they're not trusted to help solve problems too. So how can we bring that rigor and that challenge to the decision-making processes that you have in an educational system? And I think once I've hit the sweet spot there, people stayed longer, people were happier, they were more satisfied. And I, by the way, wasn't burning myself out because I had a whole team that could help me solve problems together. So I think that's been the through line for sure.
Thanks for sharing that. Anything you think folks should know about the Broad Center that they may not know today?
Yeah, absolutely. The Broad Center serves education leaders across the country, whether you're in the charter space or traditional public space. We typically have cohorts that are 50% of each. But actually, recently, we've been trending more towards cohorts that are predominantly from traditional public school systems in urban centers. And we believe if you pour into systems leaders and you show them a lot of love and a lot of connection, but also equip them with some of the tools that we equip our Fortune 500 CEOs with in terms of a world-class MBA style learning experience, they're going to be able to move mountains for children. So that's a big part of what we do. And then I would say the second part is to really engage our incredible alumni base and really create an educational ecosystem where the conditions are improved across the country so that when education leaders do step into superintendencies, they just are more nourished and they have more of the conditions necessary to ensure their success for children. So super excited to be at the helm. I have an amazing team, an amazing alumni network of almost 1,000 people across the country who've been through the Broad Centers program, and we're going to keep fighting for kids.
Well, thanks so much, Natasha. It was great talking with you today on video, and look forward to catching up again soon. But thanks so much for your time.
Of course. See you soon, Christina. Thank you. Bye.